In this episode, we're going to talk about the 1979 film Moonraker, the 11th film in the James Bond franchise. And this is the film where James Bond goes into space, gets involved in an epic laser battle with US Space Marines in zero gravity. The movie where Jaws returns, falls from a plane without a parachute and tries to flap his wings to fly in the air, gets a girlfriend, then becomes a good guy. The movie where Bond rides a gondola hovercraft through the streets of Venice and makes a pigeon do a double take. This is the film that dove headfirst into crazy levels of absurdity. Many fans will consider this a new low for the James Bond franchise, but you can't deny that this film was incredibly successful. In fact, it was the most financially successful James Bond movie in the entire history of the franchise up to that point, and remained the most financially successful James Bond film for 2 more decades, when it was finally dethroned by GoldenEye in 1995. This film also marks the moment where die-hard James Bond fans felt that Roger Moore cemented the persona of his James Bond. In Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, Roger Moore was written as a poor man's Sean Connery, but The Spy Who Loved Me was the first film that was written specifically for Roger Moore's sensibility and really allowed him to shine in that role. And it was Moonraker where Roger Moore is fully confident, shaping and solidifying James Bond into his image, creating a funny, charming, sophisticated, classy, but ultimately deadly and sadistic and effective gentleman spy. This persona will define Bond in the next few films, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and A View to a Kill. After the uber success of The Spy Who Loved Me, which proved that there was a lot more gas left in the James Bond franchise, Spy Who Loved Me proved that James Bond fandom could accept Roger Moore as a viable successor to Sean Connery. And so for their 11th film, they were going to adapt For Your Eyes Only. However, after the massive success of Star Wars, which had come out a few months earlier, but was slowly gaining box office momentum, and by the release of The Spy Who Loved Me, was a bona fide mega hit. So Cubby Broccoli decided to capitalize on the science fiction craze, and so looking at the Ian Fleming books, Cubby Broccoli realized that one of the books had the word moon in the title, and decided to use that. The book was Ian Fleming's third novel, Moonraker, and in the book, Moonraker is the name of a nuclear missile, not a space shuttle, and it was written in 1955, way before the space race. Incidentally, a moonraker is a nautical term, and it's what the sailors call the top uppermost sail of a fully rigged ship. It rakes the moon. And like in the movie, billionaire Hugo Drax is the name of the bad guy, and that's about all that's similar to the book. Moonraker will be the last Ian Fleming novel to be adapted into a James Bond book, although the movie will diverge considerably from the source material. The 1981 For Your Eyes Only will be based on a short story, For Your Eyes Only, combined with his short story Risico, and the 1983 movie Octopussy will be based on the short stories Octopussy and Property of a Lady. A View to a Kill was also based on a short story, A View to a Kill, although the story of the movie diverges considerably from that short story. The Living Daylights will be based on a short story, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill will be based on Ian Fleming's short story, The Hildebrandt Rarity. That said, Cubby Broccoli was not the first person to try to adapt Moonraker. The true origins of the movie version of Moonraker actually go all the way back to 1955, immediately after Ian Fleming had just published his third novel, Moonraker, after Casino Royale and Live and Let Die. He had already sold the license to Casino Royale, so he was desperate to make either Live and Let Die or Moonraker into his first James Bond movie. And so he decided to focus on selling Moonraker. And in 1955, American actor John Payne offered to buy the option for $1,000. Ian Fleming then tried to sell the rights of Moonraker to Rank Organization, but they ended up not making the movie. And then, of course, a few years later, he would meet Kevin McClory, and we know what happened there. And then a few years after that, Ian Fleming would meet Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, and the rest would be history. Christopher Wood, who wrote the screenplay for The Spy Who Loved Me, returned to write the screenplay for Moonraker. Cubby Broccoli wanted James Bond to go up in space and go up in a space shuttle. And at that time, NASA was about to launch the first space shuttle in 1979. An image of the space shuttle, the sleek new spaceship of the future, was everywhere on TV and on the news. Ian Productions wanted to release this movie, which had a space shuttle in it, to coincide with the real-world launching of the space shuttle, which would have been excellent marketing for the movie. Unfortunately, there were delays at NASA, and the first space shuttle would not launch for another 2 years. The first orbiter, Columbia, launched on April 12, 1981, well after the release of this movie. However, it doesn't appear that it hurt the box office of this movie. Since the movie would have very fantastic element of riding a space shuttle into space, Albert Broccoli insisted that the movie be as reality-based as possible. And so the final version of Moonraker was written by screenwriter Christopher Wood, who wrote the final screenplay of The Spy Who Loved Me. And like The Spy Who Loved Me, his screenplay was very different from Ian Fleming's novel. In the novel, Hugo Drax is a millionaire businessman who is building a powerful nuclear missile called Moonraker for Britain's defense. But Bond discovers that Drax is actually a secret ex-Nazi war criminal who plans to launch the Moonraker missile onto London as an act of revenge for the Nazi loss during World War II. In fact, the book was so different from the film that Albert Broccoli commissioned another novelization, again written by screenwriter Christopher Wood. And it would be called James Bond and the Moonraker. And it is the second official movie novelization after James Bond, The Spy Who Loved Me, which incidentally was also written by Christopher Wood. And Albert Broccoli wanted to make this movie be a spectacle that exceeded the spectacle of The Spy Who Loved Me. Remember, Diamonds Are Forever and Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun each had budgets of $7 million. And The Spy Who Loved Me doubled that budget with $14 million. Well, this movie is going to double that budget with a budget of $35 million. For location scouting, Albert Broccoli and his stepson, Michael G. Wilson, who was being groomed to take over Eon Productions, went location scouting, and one of the first places they visited was India and Nepal. And they loved the location of India, namely the Taj Mahal, but they realized they would need far more preparation to film a James Bond movie there, but they kept India and the Taj Mahal in mind for a future James Bond film and would eventually set their next movie after For Your Eyes Only, the 1983 film Octopussy, in India. The next place they visited was Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And while in Brazil, Broccoli and Wilson discovered the Iguazu Falls, and this was a huge waterfall in the south of Brazil and is one of the largest waterfalls in the world. While they were location scouting in Brazil, it was the Rio Carnival Festival at that time, and the script was not completed, and by the time the script was completed, they realized that Carnival would be long over. So they decided to bring in a film crew over immediately and film the festival as if they would film a documentary. And that way, they would get the footage and use it later when the screenplay was completed and the movie was being filmed. Now, also in 1978, Steven Spielberg contacted Albert Broccoli and offered to direct the next James Bond film, which would have been Moonraker. But Albert Broccoli turned him down and gave the directing job to Lois Gilbert, who had done an excellent job in The Spy Who Loved Me, as well as You Only Live Twice a decade earlier. Now, it was decided that much of this movie, including the space station scenes, would be filmed in Paris, France. So this would be a joint English and French production. However, to the Eon crew's dismay, the French had a very different way of doing things compared to the British or the Americans. The French production began at 11 a.m. and they worked straight for 8 hours until 7 p.m. And this was set in stone, no negotiation. If they worked 1 minute outside these hours, the production had to pay exorbitant French overtime fees. So basically, it was assumed that you only worked in those 8 hours, and there was no overtime. The actors, however, particularly Roger Moore, loved this schedule and found it very relaxing. Not only did he get to be in Paris, he got to sleep in until 11 and was done with work by 7 p.m. Originally, they wanted to cast Hollywood legend James Mason in the role of Hugo Drax. However, since this is going to be a joint British production, they had to go with a French actor as part of the stipulations of the joint agreement. Louis Jourdan was considered for Drax, and he would later go on to play Kamal Khan in Octopussy. Ultimately, Michael Lonsdale was cast as Hugo Drax. Michael Lonsdale was born in Paris, France on May 24, 1931, and was the son of a British Army officer. He moved to the United Kingdom as a child and moved to London when he was 4 years old. And during World War II, at the age of 11, his family moved to Casablanca in Morocco. Yes, the Casablanca. And when he was 16, Michael Lonsdale returned to Paris to study painting, but caught the acting bug at age 24 and became an actor. He appeared in over 180 French movies and TV shows, but his best-known English role is here as the villain opposite Roger Moore in Moonraker, as well as in the 1986 film The Name of the Rose opposite Sean Connery, and in the 2005 film Munich opposite Daniel Craig. For the role of Drax's right-hand man, Chang, he would be played by Aikido master Toshiro Suga. And apparently how he got cast was that he was Michael G. Wilson's friend. Toshiro Suga was an Aikido instructor in Paris, France, and at that time, Michael G. Wilson was learning Aikido in England from Ueshiba, who was Toshiro Suga's master. And Master Ueshiba introduced the two. And when Eon decided to film Moonraker in Paris, he specifically went to Toshiro Suga's dojo and asked him to audition for the role of Chang. And years later, Toshiro Suga said he had a great time filming Moonraker, and his greatest memory was how kind Roger Moore was, and described him as a real gentleman who was kind and treated everyone with respect. And I think that is totally awesome. Today, Toshiro Suga, who is 75 years old, lives in Paris and is a 7th Dan in Aikido, and has a successful dojo and travels throughout Europe giving Aikido seminars. For the role of CIA agent Dr. Holly Goodhead, they first offered the role to Jacqueline Smith. However, she turned it down due to scheduling conflicts with filming Charlie's Angels. While looking for an actress to play Dr. Goodhead, Louis Gilbert happened to sit next to Lois Chiles on an airline flight, and this was a total unplanned coincidence. Lois Chiles had already been offered the part of Anya Amasova for The Spy Who Loved Me, but turned it down due to having temporarily retired from acting. During this flight, Louis Gilbert was convinced that she would be perfect for the part and convinced Lois Chiles to take the role of Dr. Holly Goodhead. And Lois Chiles said that the coincidence of her sitting next to Louis Gilbert on the plane gave her a sense that being in Moonraker was destined, and agreed to be in the movie. Lois Chiles was born in Houston on April 15, 1947, and her uncle was Eddie Chiles, the oil tycoon and owner of the Texas Rangers, and she grew up in a very wealthy family. While studying in New York City, she was discovered by a Glamour magazine editor who featured her on the cover of Glamour's annual college issue, and she soon landed lucrative modeling contracts throughout the 1970s. In 1972, she starred in her first movie role, Together for Days, which also marked the first movie role for Samuel L. Jackson. And in 1973, her second role was opposite Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford in The Way We Were, which was a huge success, launching her acting career. She's been in bit parts in LA Law, The Nanny, Heart to Heart, CSI Crime Scene Investigation, and today she's best known for her role here as Agent Holly Goodhead, but other memorable roles include playing Jordan Baker in the 1974 The Great Gatsby, Jennifer Mack in the 1987 Broadcast News, and as J.R. Ewing's love interest, Holly Harwood on Dallas. Richard Kiel returns as Jaws, and he's the only villain henchman ever to appear in 2 Bond films. And we know that Jaws was very popular in The Spy Who Loved Me, so much so that during the premiere of the movie, when Jaws was seen having survived at the end of the movie, the audience cheered. So it was decided that Jaws would return in this movie. And apparently, what happened was that Gilbert originally wanted Jaws to stay a villain, but Gilbert started receiving so much fan mail, a lot of them from children, asking why Jaws couldn't be a good guy. And after a while, Louis Gilbert started paying attention to the letters from the kids and decided, okay, we'll do this for the kids, and he made Jaws a good guy. And Richard Kiel was born in Detroit, Michigan on September 13, 1939, and he was diagnosed with gigantism, which is a medical condition caused by excessive production of growth hormone. When he was 9 years old, his family moved to Los Angeles, California, and after graduating high school, Richard Kiel wanted to be an actor, and he supported himself by working as a nightclub bouncer, a door-to-door vacuum salesman, and even taught math at a night school. He soon broke into Hollywood and was cast in episodes of The Wild Wild West and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and he got roles in several movies, including The Phantom Planet, The Human Duplicators, and had a non-speaking role in Jerry Lewis's 1963 film, The Nutty Professor. He was also in The Barbary Coast, where Eon producers saw him and cast him as Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me. Incidentally, in 1977, Richard Kiel was hired as the Incredible Hulk, but after filming the pilot, the showrunners wanted someone more muscular and replaced him with Lou Ferrigno. And Richard Kiel said that he was happy to lose that role because he reacted poorly to the green contact lenses and found the green makeup very unpleasant to be in. This movie marks the introduction of Michael G. Wilson, who starts here as the executive producer. And he had been involved in the productions of past movies, but here he gets a huge promotion. He was Cubby Broccoli's assistant in the last movie, and he's also Cubby Broccoli's stepson. He's a Stanford lawyer and a pretty smart guy, and will eventually rise to take over EM Production and eventually helm the entire James Bond franchise with his stepsister, Barbara Broccoli. Now, another name to watch out for is John Glenn, who was the second unit director and filmed the ski scenes in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and was also the second unit director on The Spy Who Loved Me and filmed the opening ski sequence. In Moonraker, he'll be promoted to the editor on the film, and after Moonraker, he'll be the second unit director on the 1978 Superman, the movie. He will return to the James Bond franchise, and he's going to get a promotion in the next film and become the head director for Your Eyes Only, then Octopussy, A View to a Kill, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill. John Glenn would define James Bond throughout the 1980s. I have an interesting relationship with this movie. It was the first James Bond film that I saw in the theaters, and I was about 9 years old at the time, and I enjoyed it. But it would really be the next movie, For Your Eyes Only, that would make me fall in love with the 007 franchise. And as I became a die-hard Bond fan, Moonraker began to fall in my ratings and firmly sat in the bottom tier of the Bond films. Only recently have I begun to appreciate this as a fun and entertaining spectacle. The first half is very good. The opening scene where Bond falls out of a plane without a parachute was amazing, although they ended up crapping on the sequence by having Jaws survive that fall without a parachute. The scene where Drax takes Bond pheasant hunting while a sniper is about to kill him, and he appears to miss the pheasants, but he's killed the sniper instead. That's such a fantastic James Bond moment. The moment where Drax's dog chases his female assistant for betraying him was genuinely terrifying. But then we get to the Gondola hovercraft driving through the streets of Venice, which was ridiculous, and I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat that scene. The fight scene between Bond and Jaws on the cable cars in Brazil was incredible, and then we get the moment where James Bond goes into space. And this is where I genuinely have a great time. It's so ridiculous with the army of good guys fighting an army of bad guys with lasers shooting a pew 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 that it's so ridiculous that when I watch it now, I really can appreciate the absurdity of what I'm seeing. Now I can laugh and just have a good time and have an absolute blast while watching this. And I think what I love about this space scene in outer space is how much everyone just commits to it and plays it completely straight. This was the only way this scene could have worked. And I watched it today and I do feel it works. Because if they leaned into the camp or did a wink at the camera, I don't think it could have worked. So today I've developed a fondness and love for this movie as a very entertaining, fun time. Now, the movie starts out with a space shuttle named the Moonraker being transported on the back of an airplane. And this is how they used to transport space shuttles back in the day. So this was a familiar image if you grew up during this time. A group of criminals steals the space shuttle and fly off with it, which causes the airplane to explode in midair. Space shuttle experts tell me that there's a flaw in the sequence, and that is that whenever NASA transported the space shuttle on the back of an airplane, it never had fuel in it in order to make it lighter for transport. Oh well, I didn't know it at the time, so the scene never really bothered me. M is informed that the Moonraker shuttle has been stolen, so he sends in his best agent, James Bond, who is finishing up his last mission. Bond is kissing a female, which turns out to be a double cross out to kill him. However, Jaws from the last movie appears out of nowhere and pushes Bond out of the plane without a parachute. Now James Bond has to fly over to another parachuter, the pilot, and fight for his parachute, takes the parachute off of him, making him fall to his death, and survives only by being pursued by Jaws, who's also pursuing him in midair. And this is a great scene, and like most of the great James Bond action sequences, was done practically. These scenes were actually really done. They were not special effects. And while we occasionally cut to Roger Moore's face, for the most part, you can actually tell that the actual skydiving stunt was performed by stuntmen. The scene was actually shot in free fall by two stuntmen, Jake Lombard and BJ Worth, and they actually performed the fight choreography in the air during free fall, plummeting 100 miles an hour toward the earth. Jake Lombard, who played James Bond, wore a dummy parachute over a suit which had a real parachute under the suit. And the suit was actually kind of a breakaway suit that he could activate it without having to take off the suit. Jake Lombard had long hair and a beard, shaved the beard and got a haircut like Bond, and looked a little bit like Roger Moore, which allowed a lot of close-up shots of his face while in free fall. BJ Worth played the pilot, but was not available for the pickup shots on the plane, so another actor, Jean-Pierre Castaldi, who resembled BJ Worth, played the pilot in the pickup shots. Now there was a third diver who also had the camera mounted on his helmet. And the thing is, when you factor in setting up the actors and getting ready to fight and do the fight, they were only able to film about 2 to 3 seconds of footage per jump. And another problem they had while filming this scene was simply filming it. The scene required that the cameraman wear a film camera mounted on a helmet and free fall with the stuntmen as they fell. However, due to technology at the time, the camera was very heavy, and it was heavy enough that when the cameraman pulled the parachute, the deceleration from the chute could risk breaking the cameraman's neck. And they really didn't know what to do and considered canceling the whole scene. However, Cubby Broccoli visited a camera studio and saw that the studio had been experimenting with a lightweight Panavision camera made from plastic, and it would sit on a lightweight titanium case. However, the studio considered it a failed experiment. Broccoli insisted that they work on it and create a lightweight camera mounted on a lightweight helmet. The cameraman also worked on a mechanism that made the parachute deploy much slowly, thereby decreasing the deceleration. They did it and it worked. The cameraman with his lightweight camera and helmet could now deploy the much slower shoot without risking any injury to his neck. So once again, the Bond films change and evolve filmmaking technology. So the entire sequence took a total of 88 jumps and 5 weeks of filming just to produce 2 minutes of what you see in the opening teaser. And it's impressive how they were able to film this sequence and tell a coherent story. You really believe that Bond flew out of the plane, stole the guy's parachute, and was chased in the air by Jaws, and right when Jaws is about to bite his leg, Bond deploys his own parachute and survive. However, the intensity of this awesome action scene is somewhat compromised by the ridiculous ending, because Jaws pulls his cord, but the chute doesn't open, and then he tries to flap his arms like wings and try to fly, and then he falls into a circus tent. And we learn that Jaws is going to survive this fall, which sort of makes him immortal. And this will set the tone for the comedy in the rest of the movie. We then get Shirley Bassey returning to sing Moonraker, which is generally regarded as one of the bottom-tiered Bond theme songs, and Shirley Bassey sang Goldfinger and Diamonds Are Forever, and also sang an alternate version of Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang for Thunderball, which was not used in the film. And she's the only singer to have performed a Bond song more than once. It is interesting that the musical montage does not lean into the visual space theme of the movie. Oh well. James Bond meets with M and the Minister of Defense, who sends him to investigate Hugo Drax. Q outfits Bond with a watch that can shoot deadly darts, and this will be James Bond's primary weapon in this movie. This is the only movie where Bond does not have his Walther PPK, or his alternate Walther P99. Bond goes to California to meet Drax and is greeted by a helicopter pilot, Corinne Dufour, who takes Bond to Drax's French chateau, which is supposedly brought over from France, building the chateau brick by brick. And while this scene does take place in California, it was actually filmed in France. So it really is an authentic French chateau known as the Chateau de Ville-le-Vicomte. For the surrounding area of California, the crew actually filmed in California. And when Bond takes off by helicopter in Los Angeles, this was filmed at LAX, and the helicopter ride to the chateau was filmed in the Mojave Desert. The helicopter pilot and secretary, Corinne Dufour, was originally written to be Trudy Parker. And in the original screenplay, she was described as a sassy and slightly ditzy Southern California Valley girl. And this would make sense since they're in California, and casting an American, a distinctly Californian American, in the role would have outlined that Drax's chateau was actually in California. However, since they actually filmed the chateau scene in France, under French production rules, they had to have a certain percentage of actors be French, and so the Californian Valley girl, Trudy Parker, became the French Corinne Dufour. In fact, in the movie novelization, she is still Trudy Parker. The book was finished before the casting change. Michael Lonsdale is great as Hugo Drax, and he has this commanding and dominating presence. And we really believe that this man can conquer the business world and become a billionaire. He has this calm confidence that's brilliantly played by Michael Lonsdale, very underplayed, and he's just menacing. And is it my imagination, or does Michael Lonsdale look a little bit like Peter Dinklage? And Drax decides that he's already had enough of Bond and tells his assistant Chang to go ahead and kill him.
Look after Mr. Bond. See that some harm comes to him.
Bond is given a tour of Drax's facility where he meets this movie's Bond girl. The Bond girl is played by Lois Chiles, and despite her ridiculous name, Holly Goodhead, arguably one of the worst names in the James Bond franchise, she's a very good counterpart to our 007. I really liked her in this movie. But you can't talk about this movie without talking about the name Holly Goodhead. I really didn't mind Pussy Galore, I didn't mind Octopussy, I didn't mind Xenia Onatopp, but somehow the name Holly Goodhead always caused me to cringe a little. I'm curious, did the name Holly Goodhead bother you, or did some of the other Bond names bother you more? Lois Chiles has this smoldering intensity, and I think she holds her own as Bond's intellectual equal. And unlike Denise Richards, she is believable as a PhD scientist, and also believable as a CIA agent posing as a scientist. And instantly there is pronounced antagonism due to Bond's perceived sexism. And in many ways, this is also a story arc for James Bond where he learns to appreciate this female as his equal. And the Roger Moore James Bond is going to have a very interesting relationship with women. Sean Connery's Bond was definitely sexist by today's standards, although it may be a little ahead of its time for the 1960s. Roger Moore had Solitaire and Mary Goodnight, who were extensions of Sean Connery's James Bond's relationship with women. But then you have a series of very strong women who are able to hold their own against James Bond. Anya Amasova in The Spy Who Loved Me, Dr. Goodhead here, Melina Havelock in For Your Eyes Only, and the best Bond girl yet, Maud Adams as Octopussy in Octopussy. Dr. Goodhead gives Bond a demonstration on the centrifuge, and there's a sense that Goodhead wants to embarrass him a little, but she is called away by Chang, who increases the speed to dangerous levels. And I remember when I saw this movie as a kid, this scene really freaked me out because it felt so real. And this centrifuge is another incredible set design by Ken Adam. And when the centrifuge hits above 10 Gs, Bond's face begins to contort to the increased pressure. And I remember seeing this as a kid and being absolutely convinced that Bond was traveling at incredible speed. Well, it was actually very easy to create this illusion. Roger Moore simply had air blown on his face to simulate the pressure. Bond uses his dart gun watch to destroy the panel and break the centrifuge. Later that night, Bond seduces Corinne and convinces her to help him sneak into Drax's office, where he uses a nifty X-ray safecracker. He then takes photos of his mysterious secret plans using a miniature camera, and kudos to the little camera which has the 007 logo emblazoned on it. However, Chang has busted them from a distance, and we know unfortunately that Corinne is done for. There are also some genuinely great James Bond moments here. I love the scene where Hugo Drax invites 007 to do some pheasant hunting, and before the hunt, we get the movie leaning into its space theme, and the horn blasts the theme of 2001, A Space Odyssey. And this is the first of two musical homages to classic science fiction movies. And meanwhile, the sniper has climbed into the tree in the woods and is aiming to kill James Bond. Bond follows the pheasants flying and shoots at the birds, but apparently misses. And when Drax tells him, "You missed, Mr. Bond," Bond coolly says, "Did I?" And you see a sniper fall dead from the tree.
You missed, Mr. Bond. Did I?
It's an amazing James Bond moment. Drax realizes that his assistant Corinne has betrayed him, and he has his dogs chase her into the woods, and the tone and style of the scene changes for the next few minutes, and this scene is very effective. It has this spooky feeling of a late 1970s horror film that culminates in Corinne being brutally mauled by the dogs, and it tells you all you need to know about this character of Drax. So, yeah, Bond has gotten this poor innocent girl killed. In the next phase of Bond's investigation, he goes to Venice to visit a museum and runs into Dr. Holly Goodhead. Now, in the movie novelization, Dr. Goodhead tells Bond that Corinne Dufour, or rather Trudy Parker, the original name for the character, was killed by Drax. And James Bond is devastated and racked with guilt and even questions what career he's chosen for himself. And I really do love this, and it really adds a sympathetic dimension to Bond. However, this scene was cut out of the movie, and I don't know if it was filmed or if it was just cut. After all, Christopher Wood wrote both the screenplay for the movie and also the movie novelization, so that scene was originally intended for the movie. But without that scene, Roger Moore's Bond just comes across as callous and cold-hearted, and it's very inconsistent to what we think of Roger Moore as James Bond. James Bond takes a relaxing ride on a gondola through the canals of Venice, and suddenly he's attacked by assassins. One assassin is hiding in a coffin, gets up and kills Bond's gondolier, and tries to kill him with a knife, but Bond gets the upper hand. Another assassin is hiding in a booth with a machine gun, and others chase him on a boat. Now, originally, Christopher Wood had the idea of Bond navigating the canals of Venice on a motorcycle, hopping onto bridges and even hopping onto a gondola on his motorcycle. But then they had the idea of a high-speed gondola. So they first attached a motor to a real gondola and learned the hard way that gondolas are not meant for high speed. Once the gondola hit past 15 miles an hour, it sunk to the bottom of the canal. The crew had to build their own boats from scratch and built 4 high-speed boats that resembled the look of a gondola but could achieve speeds of 60 miles an hour. So in The Spy Who Loved Me, we had an amazing Lotus which turned into an awesome submarine, and I guess they wanted to do an inversion of that. The last film had a land vehicle that goes into water, so how about in this film we get a water vehicle that goes on land? And I can almost imagine everyone in the writer's room patting themselves on the back, giving each other high fives, saying, "That's brilliant." Well, it's not really brilliant. And I actually think it's quite a big swing and a miss. And maybe it's the inflatable raft hovercraft underneath the gondola that just gives the vehicle a distinctly uncool look. And so we have this Venetian gondola, turning into a hovercraft, which Bond drives the busy streets of Venice, while tourists and local onlookers look on doing comedic double takes. But what absolutely works in the scene in an otherwise absurd moment is Roger Moore's calm and cool demeanor while driving this crazy looking contraption. He's just so nonchalant as if he were driving to work on a Tuesday morning, and he totally sells the scene and almost saves it. Apparently the scene where the gondola bottom inflates and floats up and rides onto the dock, this scene was very difficult to film. Once the gondola's hovercraft bottom inflated, the whole thing became unsteady, rocked in the water, and threw Roger Moore into the canal waters. And he was drenched and had to go back to his dresser and change his suit. They tried filming the scene again, and again it became unsteady and tipped him over and threw Roger Moore in the water, and he had to go back and change into another suit. The problem is, they only had 5 suits for the day, and 2 had already been drenched in water, and Moore changed into his third, again into the water, and then his 4th suit, and again while filming, the gondola threw him into the water. Moore was down to his last suit, and the crew were getting worried. Fortunately, the 5th time was a charm, and they were able to film the scene successfully. Now, one of the problems filming this scene was the huge crowd of tourists in the background. Louis Gilbert and the filming crew did not expect there to be so many tourists, and they were very difficult to wrangle. Fortunately, it does add to the bit of authenticity to the scene. While Bond is driving the gondola around town, we do get the pigeon, which does this really fake-looking double take. I mean, it's just so fake-looking. Obviously, it's just a pigeon looking to the right, just rewound and forwarded the film. Well, apparently, this was a very frustrating and difficult moment to film. They had to glue a pigeon to a wooden board. Glue a pigeon to a wooden board? Yes, they actually glued a pigeon to a board and waited for him to turn his head left, which apparently took quite a while. All for a scene that has become incredibly maligned. At least the pigeon will go on to arguably become the most famous live-action pigeon in all of cinema. Now this next bit of trivia is for die-hard Bond fans only. The alcoholic sitting at the outdoor cafe in the streets of Venice sees the gondola and wonders if he's hallucinating. He is a James Bond Easter egg. He's played by actor Victor Turjansky, and he is a recurring character in the franchise known as the alcoholic or the man with the bottle. And in the world of James Bond, he is not only portrayed by the same actor, he's supposed to be the same character. He was in The Spy Who Loved Me when the Lotus came out of the ocean and onto the beach. He appears again here in Venice and will appear again in For Your Eyes Only at the Alpine ski slope. Bond then sneaks into a laboratory where the secret code is the musical theme from Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The second musical homage in this movie, and they actually got permission from Steven Spielberg to use the music. Bond observes that this lab is working on some super secret and nefarious project, and so Bond steals the vial. And this leads to another vial being broken onto the floor, which kills the 2 scientists. But Bond notices that poison is apparently deadly to humans, but not to the rats. He heads up to a museum where he's finally attacked by Chang, and a lot of valuable artwork gets destroyed, so it's a fun scene. Incidentally, during this scene, the crew broke the world's record for the largest amount of breakaway glass used in a single scene. But my question is, why does Chang, a master swordsman, try to kill Bond, a deadly government assassin who has already killed multiple people in his organization? Why does he try to kill Bond with a lightweight bamboo stick, not an actual sword? And it doesn't make any sense. Why would you take a lightweight kendo bamboo stick? I mean, those things are designed so that if you hit your opponent, you don't hurt them. They are not deadly weapons. The bamboo practice sticks, known in Japan as a shinai, is made of 4 bamboo slats bound together by leather and string, representing a Japanese katana. It's only supposed to be used in practice because it can't really harm you. The kendo uniform is known as the kendogi. And I assume the reason why the filmmakers chose the shinai rather than a real katana is that in the 1970s, to American audiences, the Japanese image of a man wearing a kendogi holding a shinai was such an iconic image that it may have been jarring for audiences to see him holding up an actual sword. It just seems so ridiculous to me that the absurdity count in this movie just keeps going up and up. Well, y'all know Chekhov's gun? Here we get Chekhov's vase, which says that if you show an expensive vase and you tell an audience how much the vase is worth, in this case millions of dollars, and then spend a few seconds on the shot of the vase, then you know that in the next scene, the vase is gonna get shattered. And sure enough, it does. Bond kills Chang by throwing him through the St. Mark's clock tower, where he lands on a grand piano. However, he notices a bunch of crates from the warehouse are marked to be shipped to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and Bond deduces that Drax plans to move his operation to Brazil. Bond sneaks into Goodhead's hotel room where he's figured out that she is really a CIA agent. And she has some pretty cool gadgets of her own. A calendar that shoots darts, a perfume bottle that's a flamethrower, and a pen that is a hypodermic needle that injects poison. All standard CIA issue. And this is really cool because it's somewhat of a play on the last film where our British secret agent teams up with a Soviet secret agent, and here Bond teams up with a US secret agent. Bond calls all of his superiors and the Italian government to make a raid on Drax's laboratory, but Drax is already one step ahead of them, and overnight he has completely moved out every bit of evidence of the laboratory, which humiliates Bond to his superiors. Fortunately, Bond still has a sample of the poison, which he gives to M, and M tells him to take leave, but continue his investigation off the books. We then see Drax make a phone call to some evil henchman employment service and places an order for an evil henchman, and they're gonna send him Jaws. And again, it's just one of those crazy, ludicrous moments in this movie that gets played absolutely straight. The idea that evil bosses have a hotline where they can place an order for an evil henchman. It's just so bizarre. So Bond arrives in Rio de Janeiro, and here we get the scenes of the Rio Carnival that they filmed months ago before this movie. And we get an amazing scene on the Sugarloaf cable car at Sugarloaf Mountain, and it's just breathtaking. And the scene was done with stuntmen, but since there are no stuntmen the size of Richard Kiel, the scene was done with a normal-sized stuntman, Martin Grace, playing Jaws, and a shorter stuntman, Richard Graydon, playing James Bond. And they really did this sequence on the cable car 2,000 feet in the air. And the stuntmen couldn't tie themselves to a safety harness because the stuntmen had to fight while weaving in and out of the cable car's wires. So they had to do the scene without being tied to a safety harness. So talk about dangerous. And there was one stunt that was particularly dangerous. If you watch the scene where James Bond falls over the side of the cable car and hangs off the side of the car with one hand, well, Richard Graydon actually did that stunt without a safety harness and actually hung over the cable car with one hand. The safety harness wasn't ready, and Graydon didn't want to hold up production, so he just did the scene. And in one scene, he's holding on for dear life on the side of the car without a safety harness. And if he slipped further, or if something went wrong, he could have fallen over the side of the cable car to his death. And Richard Graydon has gone to say that filming that scene was the scariest moment of him doing any stunt of his entire career. Knowing that, it really makes me nervous every time I see that scene. Well, Jaws attacks Bond and Goodhead, but they're able to trap him in a cable car, and they use a chain to slide down. But Jaws tries to catch them with the cable car, which leads to him crashing into the building. And in the rubble, a young woman helps him, and the two fall in love. And the woman is named Dolly, and it's the beginning of Jaws' turn to the light side, and it is an interesting choice. Well, here's a kind of cool story. The director wanted Jaws to fall in love and created this character Dolly, who was supposed to be a giant woman herself, like Jaws. But Richard Kiel suggested that the girlfriend be someone short, since his wife was also short. So they hired an actress named Blanche Ravolac, and after filming, the producers saw it and they were worried. Because they were worried that fans would not believe that Jaws, someone who's that tall, could have such a short girlfriend. Therefore, they considered reshooting the film and hiring a much taller actress, someone closer to Richard Kiel's height. However, Richard Kiel, who himself is 7'2", showed a picture of his actual wife, and his wife is the same height as Dolly. And when they saw it, the producers decided, okay, I guess it's believable, and decided to keep in actress Blanche Ravolac as Dolly in the movie. And the two walk off holding hands, and I guess that's a choice. And here's a bit of trivia for the diehard James Bond fan. I want to ask you, does Dolly wear braces in this scene? Now lock in your answer, because the answer is Dolly does not wear braces. But legions of James Bond fans remember Dolly wearing braces, and I have to admit, I'm also one of these fans. So many fans have claimed that the original theatrical cut actually had Dolly with braces, and for some mysterious reason, the filmmakers removed it and replaced it for a VHS release. Well, in reality, this appears to be a case of the Mandela effect. Dolly never had braces in any version of Moonraker. After Bond and Dr. Goodhead escape Jaws, they decide to take a few moments to make out, and they're captured by Drax's men. And Bond escapes, but Holly Goodhead is captured and presumably taken to Drax's headquarters. And as Bond escapes, we see a lot of signs for products. And yes, this was product placement. The Bond films, especially the more recent ones, have always made extra money through product placement. But it's really egregious here. We get 7 Up in the cable car scene, and as the ambulance drives up the hill, this road has been called Product Placement Row by the fans. We get another 7 Up sign, we get a Seiko watch sign, and then a sign for Marlboro cigarettes, and then the henchman crashes into a British Airways sign. And then we get James Bond dressed like a gaucho, which has to be an homage to Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. And the background music is the theme to the Magnificent Seven. So we get an interesting juxtaposition of 2 very different themes. The space theme, with space and lasers from Star Wars and the musical themes of Close Encounters of the Third Kind and 2001: A Space Odyssey, combined with a Western cowboy theme with Clint Eastwood and music from the Magnificent Seven. It's weird, but I have to say, it kind of works and balances the fine line between camp and fun. Bond goes to the Church of St. Francis Assisi, but when we see monks doing martial arts, we realize that this is a secret MI6 base. Q has analyzed the toxin that Bond gave him, and it's made from a rare orchid only found in a specific area of the Brazilian jungle. And Bond takes Q's prototype boat as Q hopes that he'll take good care of it, which of course means that it's going to get destroyed. This leads to a really cool boat chase where Bond's boat has water mines, it has a heat-seeking missile, and when it's about to go over a waterfall, Bond is able to escape by exiting on a hang glider, while Jaws breaks the steering wheel off his own boat and goes off the waterfall, and we get the crazy expression on Jaws' face. Bond finds Drax's base, which if you think about it is statistically unlikely given that he's on foot and the Amazon jungle is incredibly large. But the base is occupied by numerous beautiful women, which is right up Bond's alley. And this is another incredible set by Ken Adam. And Ken Adam wanted to build a set to look as artificial as possible in order to outline the massive expense that Drax must have put in to build this structure. Therefore, the rocks have an unnatural shiny quality, and this was an intentional touch added by Ken Adam. This turns out to be a trap, and Bond is attacked by a giant python. However, he's able to kill the python by using Holly Goodhead's secret pen with a poison needle. And this was a real python that was used. There was a man in Tarzana, Los Angeles, who has 2 giant pythons that he rents out to Hollywood films, and each python weighed 400 pounds. So the scene where a python swims in the water past the stuntman was a real python, but when we see Roger Moore actually wrestle the python, that was a fake model. But the combination of the real python with the model really looks like Bond is fighting a python. Jaws and Drax arrive and pick up Bond out of the water, and Drax says,
Mr. Bond, you defy all my attempts to plan an amusing death for you.
Incidentally, that jungle scene that was used at Drax's fortress hideout, that is known as the Twin Pyramids at the complex of Tikal in Guatemala, and it was used in another famous movie. So take a look at the scene with the pyramid in the jungle and those very woods, and that pyramid was used to represent the moon of Yavin 4 in Star Wars, aka Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. So when they said that they were trying to copy Star Wars, they really weren't kidding. And then we're taken to the entrance of Drax's headquarters, and we get another incredible Ken Adams set. And I really feel that Ken Adams really outdid himself in this movie. And this will be Ken Adams' last James Bond movie. But he'll go on to work on some other well-known films. He'll work on Pennies from Heaven with Steve Martin, the 1985 Richard Gere vehicle, King David, the 1990 film The Freshman with Marlon Brando, The Addams Family Values, The Madness of King George, which will earn him another Academy Award, as well as many, many more films. He'll continue to work until 2004 when he was a production designer and art director for the GoldenEye Rogue Agent video game. And in 2002, he was given the Art Directors Guild Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2013, he was given the Art Directors Guild Contribution to Cinematic Imagery Award for his work on the James Bond franchise. And in 2018, 2 years after his death, he was inducted into the Art Directors Guild Hall of Fame. He would pass away on March 10, 2016, at the age of 95. Drax reveals that he had to kidnap Moonraker because one of his space shuttles had an error. Bond is reunited with Holly Goodhead, and they escape being burned by the Moonraker blasting off. They obtain 2 yellow uniforms, and they themselves blast off into space. And as ridiculous as the idea of James Bond blasting off into space is, I'm impressed by how well this scene actually works. And again, it works because the crew totally took the scene seriously and absolutely played it straight. If there was any element of winking at the camera, it could have turned into a farce. But the scene looks great, and it holds up well to this day. I think this scene looks better than many CGI scenes filmed today. and I hate to say it, but they had me believing that James Bond was going into space. How were those incredible space scenes filmed, like the shot of the Moonraker space shuttle flying over the Earth toward the space station? This was 10 years before CGI, and they didn't have George Lucas's industrial light and magic. And they were also worried that traditional blue screen would not look convincing enough. So visual effects supervisor Derek Meddings had a simple but brilliant idea. He would shoot one element on a film negative, rewind the film back into the camera, and then shoot another element on the same film negative. And this proved to be surprisingly effective. And when processed, it looked seamless and really looked like a space shuttle flying in space above the Earth. And that's how the space scenes were accomplished. And then we get to Drax's space station, and it looks great, evoking 2001: A Space Odyssey. And another incredible set by Ken Adam. And as Bond and Goodhead are hiding out amongst Drax's yellow-suited crew, Drax gives his speech that reveals his overall plan. Drax plans to wipe out humanity with his deadly Orkin toxin, while his genetically superior crew survive in space, and after everyone has died, his genetically pure Superman will repopulate the Earth with himself in charge. And that is hardcore. And kind of similar to Strongbird's plan in the last movie. Agent Goodhead really kicks butt, and we feel that she's even more of Bond's equal than XXX was. And they turn off the radar jamming system, which allows the US to send their space marines into Drax's space station. And this was 40 years before the creation of the real US Space Force. And James Bond is able to convince Jaws that he and Dolly and their potential children will have no place in Drax's future. So with a reassuring look from Dolly, Jaws decides to turn on Drax and join Bond. 007 is able to turn off the artificial gravity, which causes all the people on the space station to float. And this scene is very effective. All the actors here were suspended on wires, and the scene looks fantastic. Apparently, this scene was not easy to do. Every single person you see floating were suspended on wires that were connected to the ceiling above them. And it is amazing. And we get the combat scene in outer space where the Space Marines dressed in silver have an all-out laser battle with Drax's men dressed in yellow. And the entire sequence was done with the same technique that the crew invented on this movie, of making separate passes on a single film. However, this space battle required 48 distinct shots, hence 48 distinct passes on the film. That meant that the film crew had to make 48 separate passes on a single negative of a film. And if you include the fact that the film would have to be rewound, that meant that the single piece of film had to go through the camera 96 times. And that's crazy. If a mistake happened, or a glitch happened, or one of the 48 shots got pre-exposed, or maybe the film got scratched in one of the passes, the entire film would have been ruined. Therefore, the filming crew treated each negative like it was gold dust. And apparently it was very nerve-wracking. So the crew used 20 cameras in case something went wrong, and sure enough, 14 of those negatives had a mistake or a glitch or a scratch that ruined it, and only 6 of them survived to be usable. Bond chases Drax, but Drax gets a drop on him with a pistol, but Bond uses the wristwatch, which shoots cyanide-laced darts and kills Drax and shoots him out into space. So he's dead. And this scene was homaged years later in Austin Powers, where Dr. Evil's clone Mini-Me is similarly blasted into space. And this scene was filmed by having a camera on the floor, and Michael Lonsdale was pulled upwards while suspended on a wire. And then we get the single most shocking moment in the entire movie. We get to hear Jaws' voice.
Well, here's to us.
Jaws and Dolly help Bond and Goodhead escape by releasing the stuck docking release system. The space station explodes, and we get James Bond, who has to destroy the probes containing the toxin. James Bond and Holly Goodhead follow it with the Moonraker and destroy the 3 probes, and he destroys the first 2, but the third one, right before it's about to detonate, Bond has difficulty with the targeting system because of the targeting system malfunction due to the heat of re-entry, and he has to switch off the targeting system to manual, and then he has to use his instincts to destroy the probe. Sound familiar? I practically heard Q's voice saying something like, "James, use the Force." So when they said they were borrowing heavily from Star Wars, they really weren't kidding. And sure enough, Bond successfully destroys the last probe. And in a comedic bit of reminiscence of the last movie, M and the Minister of Defense want to congratulate Bond and Goodhead, but they're too busy making love in a zero-gravity environment. And when the Minister asks,
"My God, what's Bond doing?"
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
So Moonraker was released in the summer of 1979, and it opened to mixed reviews. Critics praised the spectacular Ken Adams set while agreeing that it was both a silly and entertaining film, with most criticizing the ludicrous plot. The New York Times praised the film, saying that everyone in the cast, especially Roger Moore, was in top form. And Gene Siskel gave the film a thumbs down, heavily criticizing the product placement, while Roger Ebert loved the film and gave it a thumbs up. Another critic of this movie was a previous James Bond actor, Sean Connery, who felt that Moonraker departed too far from the credence from the reality that his movies had created. Incidentally, Moonraker was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, although it lost to Alien. It was also nominated for 3 Saturn Awards, Best Science Fiction Film, Best Special Effects, and Best Supporting Actor in Richard Kiel. Incidentally, Alien also won the Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film. The box office on Moonraker was a huge success. Made on a budget of $34 million, which incidentally was more than the budget of the last 3 Bond movies combined, and also more than the budget of the first 6 Bond movies combined. Moonraker would go on to make $210 million, which would be the highest grossing Bond movie to date, and which would hold the record for 2 more decades when it was finally defeated by GoldenEye in 1995. So whatever you think of the craziness of Bond going into space, you can't deny that it was financially a fruitful idea. Moonraker finally appeared on television on November 22, 1981, where it was a huge rating success with 39% of American households tuning in to watch it, and it was the highest rated James Bond movie on television throughout the 1980s. Today, Moonraker is considered one of the lesser James Bond movies, mostly due to the absurdity of the plot. In 2006, Entertainment Weekly ranked it number 14 out of 21 Bond films, and IGN listed it as number 11 amongst all the James Bond movies. But today, the opening skydiving sequence is considered one of the best pre-title sequences in the entire James Bond franchise. So where does the franchise go from here? Where do you take the franchise after one of the characters have blasted off into space? Well, the answer is simple. You totally bring him back to Earth and make one of the most grounded James Bond films of all time. So in the next movie, Roger Moore proves that he can also do very grounded James Bond. So tune in next week for Your Eyes Only. So that ends this video on Moonraker, and don't forget to watch my other videos on the Star Trek franchise, on Tombstone, or Robin Williams' Popeye movie. And don't forget to tell me what you thought of Moonraker. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.